Hello, welcome to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. At the Foundation, we are a community of scholars and practitioners who promote dialogue, support research and create resources in order to equip churches and those who work in them, and to facilitate the building of flourishing community through transformative change. You can find us at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hello and welcome to a conversation between Ash Cocksworth, Senior Lecturer in Theology and Practice at the University of Roehampton, and Sue Miller, the Director of the Susanna Wesley Foundation. And we're here, and when I say here, we're on Zoom, about to talk about the smile and the smiling face. And this recording is continuing our theme of flourishing. We were going to have a conference under that banner in June. This conversation is one that we might have actually had at the conference itself. So I want to start off by talking about flourishing and glory, which is where Ash started on some of his thinking around this area.
Yeah, thanks. So it's really great to be here and to be discussing such interesting themes as flourishing and glory. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is writing a book on glory. So you have to forgive me for thinking of everything in terms of glory. I think the theology of glory has some really interesting things to say about the theme of flourishing. One of the really interesting things about flourishing is that despite its almost ubiquity in church discourse, it's everywhere, everyone's talking about flourishing for good reasons. It's not much of a biblical idea. I think if you were to kind of search the Bible, there's not a whole lot on flourishing or using the term flourishing. So I think part of my thinking around glory is wondering what it would look like to locate flourishing biblically. And I think I'd want to file it in some sense or another under the theology of glory. And there are a few reasons for that I can talk through. The first is that I think glory is, of all Christian theologies, it's the most theocentric of theologies. It's about God. One of the books that I've been reading over the course of lockdown is Catherine Sonderegger's Systematic Theology. And she speaks of glory, as others have, in terms of the godness of God. So it's the thing that kind of makes God God. Often when we talk about God, we talk about the doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as God is revealed in the life of the world. But glory kind of gets at the inner life of God, which is a territory that theologians have for a while been rather fearful of treading. So I think if you're thinking about flourishing, you need to be thinking about God. Really, to flourish means to be drawn more intensively into the life of God, into the inner life of God, and as well as God, into the life of others, and more further and more intensely into our own lives. Irenaeus, the early Christian theologian, he's got this great term. He says the glory of God is being fully alive. And I wonder whether that's a good way of thinking about flourishing. It means to be fully alive.
Yes.
So that's one reason, that it's about God. And there's another thing about glory and flourishing. I think one of the key things that we've really learned when writing this book, and I say we because I've been writing it with a colleague, is that it's impossible to glorify God alone. That's one of the key things that we're discussing in the book. And there's some doctrinal mechanics involved in that. By glorifying God, and also therefore being glorified by God, you're already participating in the life of God. So there's always another involved in glory. You can't go about it by yourself. But more than that, glorification depends on the glorification of others. And the psalmist really gets this in those psalms that speak of, the whole cosmos praising God, the trees, the birds, all of God's creatures, even the weather at points, the seas and the lands, all things in their irreducible particularity are called to praise God and glorify God in their own particular ways. And there's a real connectedness there that I think lends itself quite nicely to thinking about flourishing. Sometimes flourishing, I think, might risk too much of a concentration on my flourishing, what it means for me to flourish, what are the conditions that I need in order to flourish. and to be fully alive, if we're going to use Irenaeus's claim there. But if we're talking about the kind of connectedness of flourishing, can I really flourish without others having the space to flourish? And by others, I mean all others, all things. And I think this idea of space is also quite interesting when we're engaging with discourse around creation. Are we giving space for other non-human animals to flourish in their own particular ways? Or are we taking space away from them? And I think there's some real ecological concerns there that might extend this idea of flourishing to think of the whole world flourishing. Calvin's got this claim. He speaks of creation as the theatre of God's glory. And I wonder whether we could think of creation as the theatre for flourishing, and the whole of the created cosmos being called to flourish, and what it might mean for us to allow space for all things to flourish in order for us to flourish, as glorification, needs others to glorify ourselves. So there's a real complexity there, I think, within the discourse of glory that can help us to unpack not only what it means to flourish as it relates to God, but also what it means to flourish mutually, in a community, in a cosmos of multiple flourishings.
Yes.
So I think, there are other reasons that glory can help us out. But in terms of doctrinally filing flourishing, I think I'd want to locate it somewhere pretty close to glory.
Yes, and I hope our listeners will take this up and respond to your thoughts there. I love the notion of the as creation as a theatre of flourishing, which connects to some of SWF's other work, which it's starting on in relation to creation, which is something that we'll talk about in other podcasts, and which I think Ash, you may become involved in.
The other great, by the way, Susanna Wesley Foundation link to glory is glory as it appears in the hymns of Charles Wesley. Glory is one of those, really kind of key themes. If anyone's going to get glory, I think it's the Wesleys, and there's a good theological reason for that. Think of, the hymns, how we're changed from glory to glory. What does that mean anyway? Changed from glory to glory. But there's some kind of Methodist sensibility there, which has something to say with the priority of singing. Singing is one of the primary ways that we give glory to God, that we glorify God. And I think, for those who haven't been able to sing over the course of lockdown, it has something to do with how we can flourish. I've certainly
we're missing something.
We're missing something quite fundamental, actually.
Yes, and I think a lot of people would share that notion, even if they haven't articulated it in that way that you're describing. I was tempted to ask you how you would interpret glory to glory, but I don't think we'll go there at this moment, because I want us to move into the conversation around the smile and the smiling face. And we talked about the connection between flourishing and glory, but what about the smile? Why the smile? How did we come to the smiling face in this process of thinking about glory?
Yeah, well, so we've been writing this book on glory, and we got to the section on the Christian life. So there's a chapter on the Christian life. And there's been, a fair bit of discussion about what could be called the doctrinal mechanics of glorification. The idea of giving glory to God asks some really interesting doctrinal questions, actually. And also the question of how we receive glory from God is also dependent upon a fairly complex set of doctrinal claims and Christological claims as well. But there's been quite a lot written on those doctrinal mechanics. And we wanted to shift focus a little bit away from how it can be said that we give glory and how it can be said that we receive glory to what glory feels like in the Christian life. So our main concern in that chapter is not how we're glorified, but what glorification actually looks like and feels like in the everyday, really ordinary reality of actual Christian living. And we felt that there were three really important dimensions to think through in terms of, the ordinary reality of actual living the Christian life. And these are glory experienced, and glory embodied, and glory enacted. And we think that if you cover those three themes, the experiential issues around embodiment and issues around practice, how glory is enacted, you're kind of covering some of the main features of, what it means to live ordinary lives. So in terms of glory experienced, we felt that, the way that glory is really experienced in the Christian life is through the feeling of joy. When you feel joyous, that's a sign of God's glory at work in your life. In terms of glory enacted, we're thinking of glory in terms of the Sabbath rest, which is quite an interesting form of action, rest. But how creation, the Westminster Confession says the chief end of humanity is to glorify God. And what would it mean to think of the Sabbath as a day of anticipating the final glory that is to come? And that leaves glory embodied. And we've pretty quickly settled on the smile as the key way that glory is embodied in the Christian life. Why did we settle on the smile?
That would be the question. Yeah.
Well, all of this book on glory, the entirety of it, has been written in lockdown. And it's a really funny thing to write a book in lockdown. And the way that we've managed that is, as so much of life is organised now, to meet regularly over Zoom. And we had some really flourishing conversations. I should say my co-author is David Ford, who was my doctoral supervisor. And we're writing this book together. Glory has been one of the really important themes across David's writings for many, many years now. So it's been fascinating to kind of work with him and think with him in relation to the theme. But anyway, we met regularly over Zoom to have some conversations around some of the key glory texts in the Bible. And we took John 17, we took some Psalms, and we took Ephesians too, and did some textual reasoning, reading these texts alongside each other and through each other to see what we could come up with in terms of glory. But at every stage of meeting on Zoom, of writing this book, of all the reading that I've been doing, has been accompanied by Lucy, who was born in lockdown. We're calling her Lockdown Lucy for the time being. And it's an amazing yeah, it's an amazing thing to think that, her life has known nothing but being in lockdown. Yes. Lucy's our first, and she really provided the raw material for the smile. So as we began thinking about the Christian life and what it might mean to embody glory in everyday human existence, it so happened that Lucy learned to smile. And we'd begin each Zoom session with me, showing Lucy off to David and her gradually, but surely smiling. And Lucy has the most amazing smile. Well, not always at night time, but the smile is there. And a load has been said from all sorts of disciplines, including developmental psychology, about the first smiles of a baby. Whether it's instinctive, whether it's imitative, whether it's something a baby learns, or whether a baby just smiles. But for us, it was an example of joy. It was pure joy. It was the eruption of joy, the overflow of joy. And it brought a smile to our faces.
It's shared, yes.
It's shared, yeah. The smile begets a smile. Smiles produce more smiles, but not, this going back to our question of ecology, not in a competitive manner. So the more I smile doesn't mean the less you might smile, Sue. But a smile enhances another. It plays by a different logic than a scarcity model where one takes away from another. In fact, the more Lucy smiled, the more I smiled, the more she smiled. It had this logic of abundance, as we're calling it.
I guess those listening are smiling if they're hearing this. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was an amazing thing also to see this smile. Lucy means light, and light is a glory word, of course. And it was a smile which lit up, a rather kind of bleak time for many of us. And there was something about the profundity of this immensely ordinary thing that kind of lit up the world, really. And we found that that's just what a great thing to think about generally and in relation to the smile. But there's one other contextual issue that I might just say around the smile. And it again relates to the world that we live in now. If you think back to those early days of lockdown, so Lucy was born in April, end of April. And in those early days of lockdown, it coincided with those many walks that we'd have to do in the pram, learning how to be a parent, learning how this whole sleep thing works. And the only form of physical expression we had with others was the smile. We weren't in contact with others, with our families or with anyone. And this was a time before masks. And I think that just changes the dynamics in interesting ways, actually. It expands the repertoire for smiling in interesting ways. But I began to think, as one of those many walks trying to get Lucy to sleep, the smile is probably the most intensive form of physical expression that we've got at the moment. And I certainly still do, actually, but maybe more consciously then, made a real effort to smile at people when I pass them at a socially distance. But to pass them on the street and to share a smile, as you said, sharing a smile. And I don't know whether it's just because I was looking out for them, but I kind of felt during those early days of lockdown, especially, people were smiling more, in some sort of bodily gesture to say that this is the best we've got at the moment. But it gives a great deal. Maybe people like I was, making an extra effort to compensate for the lack of physical contact in lives. But suddenly smiles were all over the place.
Almost as a quest for connection, you think?
That's a great way of putting it, a quest for connection. Yeah, exactly. So Lucy was the raw material, but it was coinciding with smiles being everywhere and also nowhere, in a sense. I'm thinking now I'm seeing you smile, Sue, over Zoom. And, as we're all Zooming for many hours of the day, it's also the primary mode of communication that we might have with non-verbal communication that we might have on Zoom. There's only so much you can give away on Zoom, but the smile is one of those signifiers of emotions. And I like to, in the book at least, try to locate that emotion as the feeling of joy. So the smile is the overflow, quite literal overflow of the joy in our hearts, overflowing out of the body into the world and distributing or sharing joy, disseminating joy as it moves.
So how would you align that with the fact that we're talking about smiles in lockdown from people who are strangers, but sharing that smile between them and almost a hunger for that, which is what you were describing, at a time which for many people is not actually a time of joy at all, quite the reverse. So where does the smile and sadness come together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've kind of been harboring a bit of inner guilt, actually, for thinking about such kind of richly generative and joyous themes, such as joy and the smile, in an otherwise really kind of bleak world. And I kind of feel like whether it's either the most appropriate time for thinking about those themes or the least appropriate time, and I kind of move between one or the other. But one of the threads that we pick up on in the argument has been introduced by Willie Jennings, who's written about joy as a form of resistance. And I quite like the idea that even in the kind of bleakest moments, that joy can resist that. And I think the smile could be an embodiment of that form of resistance. Christian discourse on bleakness, I don't think there is a Christian doctrine of bleakness, but would want to say that, even in those most awful of moments, that's not going to last forever. It won't always be like this. And Karl Barth, who's someone I've spent quite a lot of time with, speaks about joy as anticipatory joy, as he puts it. And I wonder whether, that's a form of resistance too, as a way of kind of locating yourself in a way to say, actually, there's things going on here that...
Yes. So a sort of display also of hope that things will move forward.
Yeah, hope.
Yes.
One of the things that we've been tracing as we think through this theme of the smile is that the smile doesn't actually feature that much in Christian theology. There hasn't been much work on the smile. There's been a whole bunch of stuff on laughter, but less on the smile. And so there's been some real kind of detective work that's needed to be done to find out who has written about the smile. And it turns out not many people have written about the smile. And that's a really interesting question, what to do with the smile when there's a lack of theological resources to help you think about it. But one of the things that I did discover is that, so I'll take you back right to the beginning, not only to life cycles, but back to Genesis. And in godly play, and people might be familiar with godly play. I think I'm going to become more familiar with godly play as Lucy grows up. But in godly play's telling of Genesis 1, it says that in the beginning was the smile. On the first day after God had created light and darkness, God showed God's joy at what was created with an enormous smile. Not just a smile, but an enormous smile. You've got also that logic of abundance there coming back in. The problem is, as godly play says, nobody was there to see it. And that's a kind of really bizarre idea, I think, that not only at the beginning of the life cycle, but at the beginning of all things was a smile. And there's been some really interesting discussion about what could be called the voiced smile. And this, I think, is really relevant, again, to the wearing of masks, where masks now kind of hide a smile. I think if we can begin to expand the repertoire for what we might think of the smile as, it is the physical gesture, the physical movement of muscles, but it can also be expressed through the voice. And you get this coming up in disability theology and writings around blindness. You know, what happens when you can't see a smile? Well, you can hear a smile. And part of me would quite like to think, when the Christian doctrine of creation says a lot about God creating not out of conflict, but out of speech, you know, calling all things into existence. And I wonder whether there's something there that, you know, godly play says not only that God smiled, but God created through the smile. You know, God brought all of human existence through a voiced smile. And I think there's something really interesting there to be tackled. So in that sense, the smile is both at the beginning of the life cycle, I think, and also the beginning of all things. In terms of the beginning of the life cycle, you know, there's been so much discussion about this from discourses outside of theology, and there's a long-running argument amongst developmental psychologists as to whether it is instinctive or whether this is something that babies pick up on, you know, as they see their smiling parents and smiling others smiling down on them. That discussion hasn't been resolved yet. The argument hasn't been settled, but some would say it's a matter of hours after, you know, the birth of a child that the baby starts to smile. In other words, it's kind of written, it's hardwired into our bodies, so that one of the first emotions and one of the first embodiments of those emotions takes the form of a smile.
Yes, I remember the beatific smile on my son's face after he'd been fed, which we never managed to capture. I think nowadays with a smartphone one would, but we didn't then. And that was actually not actually shared. That was his own self-satisfaction almost. But anyway, that's, so I don't know how that feeds into the argument. But so we're on the both life and the life cycle. And can we come towards the end and the smile?
Yeah, so I think smiles are at the beginning, but also at the end. And I said earlier that there hasn't been much written about the smile from a theological perspective. The person who has actually put to poetry the smile in a really interesting way is Dante. And in his Divine Comedy, it ends, and I can just read you out this line right at the end. It says, "Eternal light, you only dwell within yourself, and only you know you, self-knowing, self-known. You love and smile upon yourself." So there's been some studies on the smile in Dante and in his Divine Comedy, that the closer Dante gets to paradise, the more frequently he uses the smile, and he puts it on the faces of all of his key characters. And the closer he gets to paradise, the more his key characters are smiling. And I think for Dante, the Christian life, in a sense, ends with an encounter with the smile that was there at the beginning, yet no one was there to see it. Now, finally, you know, you might see face to face the smile of God. You know, at the chief end of the Christian life is a smile, and that smile expresses something of the abundance of joy that's within the life of God. So it's there at the beginning and right at the end. And in between, if you're going to use Barth's terms of joy being, and anticipating something. I think the smile that we share between ourselves and with others, is the kind of sign of that smile that's to come. That smile when, you're greeted finally with the smile that was there right at the beginning. I think that's a really kind of powerful moment.
So, talking about where the smile actually appears in the Bible, there's a lot about faces and shining faces, but the smile as a named entity, is it there? And what would you say about that?
Yeah. So you're right. The face is completely important, and there are all sorts of faces in the Bible. And interestingly, going back to our theme of glory, faces and glory kind of go together. So many of the key glory texts in the Bible involve faces. So think of Moses' face, how it was changed after encountering the presence of God's glory. Paul speaks of how the glory of God shines on the face of Jesus. At the Transfiguration, which is one of the kind of key glory episodes in the New Testament, Matthew has his disciples falling face down, as the sun's face shines like the sun, he says. And Christian living, in a sense, is all about being faced with the face of Christ, in whose face we face the glory of God. And because of this, I suppose face and facing have both been really theologically generative. There's been a whole bunch of stuff that's been written about face and facing. But the smile is a much more unusual focus of theological attention. And it's probably because there's not much really in the Bible that references smile. And part of me got thinking that actually when the face is often used in theological discourse, it tends to be much more in the phenomenon of the face rather than in its physiology, in its actual features. When I first started teaching theology in a theological college at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, one of my colleagues was John Hull, and he's got some really interesting reflections on the face that's written from his perspective of being blind. And he said the problem with a lot of discourse on the face is that it's almost featureless. It's just a face. It's not a face that smiles or frowns. It's not a face with a specific gender. It's not a singing face, he says. So I think the smile can help to give a little precision to existing discourses on the face. But yeah, the smile and the Bible, well, I suppose, I'm interested that there is no explicit reference to Jesus smiling in the Gospels. And why is that? We know that Jesus wept, but there's no, to my knowledge, account of the historical Jesus or his disciples, in fact, smiling. And it strikes me that the Christian tradition has always found it much easier to talk of the man of sorrows, the man who weeps, who suffers and suffers alongside others, than the man of smiles. And perhaps this is why it's not only in the Bible that there's a lack of smiling, but there's a real lack of references to the smiling Christ in liturgical resources, in prayers and liturgies. It's not really there in much poetry or in hymn writers or in visual arts. So there seems, to be a lack of, this is what I mean about the raw materials for smiling. You've got to think a little bit more expansively than just the Bible. I mean, the key question is, why isn't there an account of Jesus smiling? If smiling is such an ordinary and to an extent kind of unremarkable characteristic of being human, perhaps
that's why. Then
perhaps that's why. Yeah, it was so obvious. It was more important to say that Jesus, shed tears than it was that Jesus smiled.
Yes, I can see that. And in art, Christian art, are there any examples that you would particularly note? Maybe ones that you've seen with a smile which have entered your mind as you've been thinking about the smile for this book?
Yeah, well, this is actually a really live and interesting bit of research that's going on here. It's basically, smiles were few and far between in material culture, in the material culture of Christianity, until around the mid-13th century, in fact. And historians of art called this the advent of the Gothic smile. And up until this point, there weren't really that many depictions of the smile in material culture. When the smile was visually depicted, it was often on the faces of demons and devils.
Is that a smile?
Yeah, is that a smile? I mean, developmental evolutionary theory would suggest that actually the origins of the smile were not in the experience of joy, but came about through a more kind of violent showing of the teeth almost to ward off predators. So there's something kind of, going right back to the beginning,
yes.
That there might be a reason why, up until this point of the advent of the Gothic smile, it featured on devils and demons rather than saints.
So the masks might be quite useful in distinguishing between an authentic and an inauthentic devilish.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But that's another really big issue as to what counts as a smile.
Yeah.
What's a real smile and what's a feigned smile.
Yes.
And that goes back to the very beginnings about, is Lucy actually smiling because she's really pleased to see me, or is she smiling for other reasons?
Yeah.
But anyway, this Gothic smile is hugely interesting because all of a sudden, all around Northern Europe, people like the Virgin Mary learned to smile, and with her a whole company of angels. You can go to Lincoln Cathedral, by the way, to see the angel choir, to see all the smiling faces of angels. And on the faces of the elect, so on the faces of the saints, and also on the faces of prophets. A few years back, when I had a period of study leave, I walked with my father-in-law, Lucy's grandfather, a bit of the Camino, the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage route. Yeah. And for those who have been there, pilgrims enter the cathedral, the end point of the pilgrimage, through the Port of Glory, it's called. It's an interesting glory reference there.
Yes.
And there, right above the Port of Glory, is the smiling statue of Daniel. So here, right at the end of one of the most important pilgrimages in the medieval world, the first thing the pilgrim would see after a really kind of physically and emotionally grueling journey was a smile from the prophet of God, and I think that's also something about the chief end of humanity. If it's in a smile, I think there's a gesture there. So mid 13th century, you get a whole bunch of smiling faces, and for the first time you also get some smiling Jesuses. And there are a few examples, but not many, of Jesus smiling on the cross. This goes back to your earlier discussion about smile and sadness. And there are a couple of crucifixes which depict a stripped, an outstretched Jesus hanging on the cross, and radiating from his face is what I think is one of the most unexpected of expressions, a smile. And it's quite astonishing actually to look at. And it got me wondering why is Jesus smiling at this moment of profound suffering? And I think I've got some hunches there, but I might save those for another time.
Yes, do. This is a very rich and fascinating conversation, and I'm really grateful to you, Ash, for sharing what you're working on at the moment, and we'll look forward to the book coming out. I just wondered whether we might finish with just some reflection on actually in doing this work. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you made an effort to smile when you were out pushing Lucy in her pram. In terms of our practice or our going forward now, what would you want to say about how we can think about this to enrich the way in which we behave towards one another?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Sue. I think one of the things that I've been struck by is that if we're thinking of the theme of glory, if we're thinking about flourishing, it's the idea that glory and flourishing happens on the most ordinary of levels. Ignatius has got this idea that everything can be done for the glory of God, even the smallest thing, even such a thing as the smile has an almost disproportionate impact on the world. It doesn't take much to smile, but it can do all sorts of amazing things, I think, in the world. It's something of God that can flicker in the midst of everyday life. And I'm always really interested in these everyday, ordinary things. The world can be transformed, I think, from the most ordinary of things. And sometimes I think, especially when we're facing all the complexities of the things that we're facing at the moment, some sense of the role of the everyday, the ordinary, and all of that is important. And I want to hold on to that. The smile, it's a radiation of joy. It's something that communicates to others joy, that makes others respond in kind. We talked earlier about the smile, creating smiles. And I think it has a really curious capacity to deepen relationships, as you say, to deepen relationships with others. It can generate new relationships, such as the smile that you might share with a stranger on the street.
Yes.
I think it can intensify existing ones. The silent smile that's shared year after year with someone that you really love. In that sense, the smile is a kind of an example of an endless flow of communication. Think of how much can be communicated just through the smile between people who really know each other. And it can heal damaged relationships as well. I think it has this curious capacity to do a whole bunch of stuff, because the smile is always more than smile. I think it's a way of extending the smile of God into the world. And I wonder whether I can end on another visual example of the smile, which I think is one of the most curious ones, and it has a real impact on what we're discussing here. And it's for those who know Coventry Cathedral well, will recognise the Graham Sutherland tapestry, which is called, by the way, Christ in Glory. And it's the most amazing tapestry. It's huge, it's ginormous. And the first thing that you see when you walk into the cathedral is this massive, great big Jesus, this massive, great big risen Christ in glory. And part of the liturgical choreography of the cathedral is such that, when we participate in the Eucharist, we kind of move our bodies closer to kind of see this tapestry, and you kind of notice a little bit more about the dynamics of Christ's face. You see a little bit more about the expressiveness. And the closer you get, the more I see, and I'd be curious to hear from others who know this tapestry, whether they see the same thing, but whether, they see glinting on the face of Christ a smile. This isn't a complete smile. There's still the kind of lingering Christ of sorrows tradition there. But I think there is a smile. It's the unmistakable beginnings of a smile that really dazzles. Now, for those who do know this, you'll see that you've got a huge, great big risen Christ in glory, and then clamped at Christ's feet is a single person who's there to represent, I suppose, all of humanity. And this person looks so small in comparison to the massiveness of the depiction of Jesus, but it's actually quite large in size. It's just to say something about the scale of the tapestry. But unlike the expressiveness of the face of Christ, this figure is faceless. And I wonder whether this has something to do with Paul's idea of being changed from glory to glory, being formed for glory. And I wonder whether the liturgical choreography of Coventry Cathedral is such that you go up to receive, you're greeted by this smiling Jesus. And when you turn around, you kind of see the world as Christ sees the world. You see the world with a smile. And for those who can imagine Coventry Cathedral at this point, when you turn around having received communion, you look through those stained glass windows at the end, through which you see the ruins of the old cathedral. And I think there's some real significance there. As you turn to face the world, you turn to face the world as Christ sees the world, with a smile. And in that sense, the face depicted on the tapestry isn't so much faceless as formless, as ready to be formed into the likeness of Christ, which means, in a sense, putting on the smile of Christ and sharing that smile to others. So I think you could even go so far as to say that the smile is a means of grace. It's a way of bringing people into the life of God. It's about sharing joy and communicating joy, and therefore communicating something of the love of God in a world which is difficult.
Well, thank you very much, Ash. I think we should end on that note, and I think we should go out from here, and I'm going to feel differently about the smile and going to see it differently. Thank you so much, and we look forward to publicising the book on our website.
Thanks very much, Sue.
Thank you for listening to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. You can engage with our work through following us on Twitter and Facebook, and at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We would love to hear from you.